What does Satan look like? That's such a weird question, you might never have asked it before. You might think I'm weird for even posing it. But whether you ever wanted to know or not, you can find out today on the Cross References podcast. Welcome to the Cross References podcast, where you learn how every small piece of the Bible tells one big story, and most importantly, how they all connect to the cross and Christ. Whether you're a newbie Christian or a veteran Bible reader, our goal is that God's Word will make more sense to you after every episode. This is Luke Taylor. I'm a pastor and a turtle fan. The turtles are probably my favorite animal. Now, do I have a logical reason why? Well, not really. I just like turtles, and I don't really understand people who don't. Back in 2014, my family went on a trip to Hawaii. And in Hawaii, there are turtle trinkets everywhere. Turtles are like a major thing in Hawaii. If you buy a hat, a necklace, a shirt, a souvenir, it's probably got a turtle on it. Turtle paraphernalia, I guess you'd call it. It's everywhere in Hawaii. And they also use a lot of shark tooth imagery, surfboards, things like that, but especially turtles. Now, one thing you can find at a lot of gift shops in Hawaii also are tiny little idols. And they're just little statues that are in the style of things that I guess the Hawaiian people of long ago, what they used to worship. It's interesting to find these little trinkets of Hawaiian culture, but I did not buy any of the idols to take home when I was out there. And why is that? Well, because idols are associated in the Bible with demonic activity. And I didn't want to open myself or my home up to a demonic presence by bringing it home with me. Even if it was something as small as a keychain. The book of 1 John, it ends with telling us to keep ourselves from idols. So I'm going to take that seriously. Now, you might think I'm being superstitious with that, but just wait until you hear me out on what we discuss on today's program. So we're in a section of Ezekiel that details the massive vision that God gave Ezekiel when he picked him up in Tel Aviv, and that was back in chapter 8, and he showed Ezekiel all the things going on in Jerusalem. And God is showing Ezekiel exactly why he would destroy Jerusalem and how much suffering God was going to inflict on this city. And throughout the process, we have once again come face to face with these heavenly creatures that are called the cherubim. Or perhaps I should say we've come face to face to face to face to face because the cherubim have 4 faces. The cherubim are these really strange creatures who go before God's throne and guard his presence. They have 4 faces. There's one on each side of their head. And it's implied to me that I guess this is so they can always see all 4 directions. And so nothing can ever sneak up on God or catch them by surprise. And they continuously go before God as his throne room guards. So as we read in chapter 10, God's presence is vacating the temple in Jerusalem. God is officially abandoning the people. He's not going to hang around there anymore. God is departing his temple. And so as he leaves, the last thing that Ezekiel sees are these cherubim that he also saw back in chapter 1. And that's what we're discussing today, the cherubim themselves, and what secrets we can unlock as we study them. So I'm going to turn our attention to 2 verses in particular from chapter 10. It was verse 14 and then 22. So let's start with Ezekiel 10:14. Ezekiel wrote, "And every one had 4 faces. The first face was the face of the cherub, and the second face was a human face, and the third the face of a lion, and the fourth, the face of an eagle." So the faces are a lion, a cherub, a human, and an eagle. And Ezekiel had viewed these same creatures back in chapter 1, and that was what we covered on episode 5 of this podcast. However, there's a little bit of a difference from the creatures in chapter 1 as opposed to chapter 10. So let me read Ezekiel 1:10. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 10. "As for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side, the 4 had the face of an ox on the left side, and the 4 had the face of an eagle." So 3 of the 4 faces are the same, but on one of them it says the face of an ox. In chapter 10 it said the face of a cherub, but back in chapter 1, Ezekiel called it the face of an ox. And this word for ox is shor in the Hebrew. The way it's rendered in English, it's S-H-O-W-R, it's pronounced shor. But it's a word that means an ox, a bull, or a head of cattle. It's what we would call it a bovine animal in English. And that means a cattle type of animal, such as cows, buffalo, bison, bulls, calves, anything like that. We call that bovine. So why was there the switch? Why did it say an ox or a bovine animal in chapter 1, but then call it the face of a cherub in chapter 10? Well, to start, let's remember a couple of things about chapter 1. In that chapter, Ezekiel was caught off guard, very off guard, by the arrival of these heavenly creatures. He's just sitting on the side of the hill, looking out at the canal, probably feeling sorry for himself and that he's a captive, that he can't be at home, being a priest in the temple, when all of a sudden, God and these 4 creatures arrive. And so he doesn't know what to call them. And so his grammar and his word choice, it sounds very overwhelmed and freaked out. So when Ezekiel sees the creatures in chapter 10, he's much calmer as he writes about this experience. And he's learned a little more about spiritual things, apparently, in the meantime, between these 2 visionary experiences. Now he knows that they're called cherubim. His description of them is a little bit clearer. And so at this time, he understands that the face that he previously thought was an ox's face, that it's actually a cherub's face. It looks ox-like, but it's actually a slightly different type of face. And now how is it different? I don't know. All I know is that at first glance, it looks like a cow or a bull type of face. And in case anyone is wondering if perhaps the creatures in chapter 10 are just maybe different from the ones in chapter 1, well, let me read Ezekiel 10:22. He said, "And as for the likeness of their faces, they were the same faces whose appearance I had seen by the Chebar Canal. Each one of them went straight forward." So Ezekiel confirms for us right here, the cherubim in chapter 10 are the same creatures with the exact same faces as the living creatures that he saw in chapter 1. Now, why does any of this matter? Why am I spending so much time establishing that a cherub's face looks ox-like or bovine? Well, it's because as you dig into this subject, you find the answer actually solves a lot of mysteries in the Old Testament. For example, why did the Israelites have this problem with worshiping golden calves? Of all the things to make an idol out of, why did they like cows so much? Well, I think our study today will answer that question of why. Let's start by jumping ahead in Ezekiel to chapter 28. We're gonna get there eventually in our Bible study on this book. At the rate that we're going, I'd say that's going to be at least a year away. So you get a sneak peek right here of Ezekiel chapter 28. And so in Ezekiel 28, this is one of the rare places in Scripture where we actually get a description of Satan. God goes into some detail of who and what Satan is. Now, God also does this in Isaiah, but right now we're just going to look at Ezekiel, and in Ezekiel 28, it's addressed to the prince or the king of Tyre. But I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, it's actually about Satan. Now, why do I say that? Well, let's talk about what it means when it says, the prince of Tyre. When it says that, it's talking about the chief ruler of Tyre. The word prince means the top leader. Prince simply means first, okay? Prince is just a word. It's a part of a lot of words that means first. Like when we talk about the leader of a school, we call them the principal. It means the top person in charge of the school. When we talk about the ideas or values that guide our lives and our decision making, we call those our principles. It means the things that come first, okay? So, and maybe a better word to bring up here is principality. That's a word the New Testament uses to discuss the spiritual beings in high places, the spiritual beings who influence what is taking place on the world. They're called principalities. And that's who Ezekiel is writing to directly in chapter 28. It's the principality who is in charge of Tyre. And in fact, the principality in charge of Tyre at this time, in Ezekiel 28, it was actually Satan himself. It's the devil. And how do I know this? Well, let's keep reading. We're going to jump down to verse 12 of that chapter. As we look at Ezekiel 28:12, and this is really God speaking through Ezekiel to the devil. It says, "You are the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering." Now, let me stop there for a second. It says the king or the prince of Tyre was in the Garden of Eden. Now, was the literal, physical, human leader of Tyre in Eden? Well, no, obviously not. But who was? Well, we only know of a few people who were in the Garden of Eden. We know of Adam, Eve, God, and Satan. And this chapter is telling us some things about Satan, like that he was originally one of God's spiritual creatures who served in heaven. And listen as it describes him. We're going to continue with verse 13. Talking about all these precious stones that were on him. Sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, emerald, and carbuncle, and crafted in gold were your settings and your engravings. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were an anointed guardian cherub. So Satan was a cherub, which is the singular form of cherubim. One cherubim is just called a cherub. And this is what Satan was. Now, did Satan have 4 faces or just one? And I honestly don't know. I don't know enough about cherub physiology to know if they all look exactly the same. But I would say that at the very least, he had the face of a cherub since he was a cherub. All right, let's keep reading. I placed you. You were on the holy mountain of God. In the midst of the stones of fire you walked. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, till unrighteousness was found in you. In the abundance of your trade you were filled with violence in your midst, and you sinned. So I cast you as a profane thing from the mountain of God, and I destroyed you, O guardian cherub, from the midst of the stones of fire. Your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. So Satan became prideful because of his beauty. Isaiah 14 also tells us that Satan was very proud and wanted to be worshipped like God. So he was cast out of heaven when, as it said, when unrighteousness was found in him. Okay, so we've established that Satan was a cherub and that the face of a cherub looks like the face of an ox or a bovine animal. Now let's talk about another figure from the Bible, especially in the Old Testament. It's a false god named Baal. B-A-A-L. You see Baal all throughout the Old Testament. And there's constantly people who are drawn into worshiping him. Now, have you ever looked up what a Baal idol looks like? Baal was sometimes depicted as a man, but he usually looked like a person with a bull-like head. Sometimes he was depicted as just a bull or a calf, but usually he had a man-like body and a bull-like head with horns. So as you read all throughout the Old Testament that the Israelites, they were drawn to worship Baal. Baal was often set up as the antithesis of Yahweh. There were prophets of God and prophets of Baal. You read this all through the Old Testament. So we also see a problem in the Old Testament of Israel worshiping idols of calves. You see that most famously, I think, right after the Red Sea crossing, and that's in the book of Exodus. You see it right after Solomon's death many years later in 1 Kings 12. And it said Jeroboam takes the throne, and he sets up some calf idols. 1 Kings 12, 28 and 29, they say, So the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold. And he said to the people, You have gone up to Jerusalem long enough. Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And he set one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. So what is with the spiritual draw of people to worship cows? Is either these golden calves or in the figure of Baal? Why are so many people obsessed with wanting to worship cows? Well, I think I have an answer. I think that spiritual yearning is because Satan is trying to get the Israelites to worship something that looks like himself. I think Satan, being a cherub, he has a bull-like face, and so he tries to get the Israelites to worship bull-like creatures. It's actually a worship of Satan himself. And somehow he draws or he urges people to worship an image of what he looks like. It makes me think of how, sometimes we say, holy cow, whenever we're shocked. And I've always wondered, what's that all about? Why do we say holy cow? And so I try not to use that phrase. And because of these Old Testament passages, I'm not trying to be legalistic here or impose that on you. I'm just saying, I question where that comes from, that we try to say holy cow. Why say that a cow is holy? I just try to avoid that myself. In 1 Kings chapter 1, there's this evil king named Ahaziah, and he's near death. And Elijah brings this king a message to say that Ahaziah is not going to be healed, and that God's not going to help Ahaziah because Ahaziah first sought help from Baal. And so here's what Elijah said. It's in verse 16. Thus says the Lord, because you have sent messengers to inquire of Baal-zebub, the god of Ekron, is it because there is no God in Israel to inquire of his word? Therefore you shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die. God is so mad that Ahaziah has asked Baal for help that God tells him, you're not going to get help, you are going to die. And God doesn't just call him Baal right there. Notice that he calls him Baal-zebub. Now that might sound familiar to you, and that's because Jesus talked about Baal-zebub in the New Testament too, but it's spelled a little differently over there. And probably because, hundreds of years later, spellings change over time, but it's such a unique name. I mean, this has got to be talking about the same figure. So listen to what the Pharisees say in Mark 3:22. It's whenever Jesus is casting demons out of people. He's going around setting people free. And in Mark 3:22 it says, "And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, 'He has Beelzebub, and by the ruler of demons he casts out demons.'" So they refer to Beelzebub or Beelzebub as the prince of demons, the chief leader of demons. That sounds a little bit like the devil, right? And then Jesus hears them talking about Beelzebub, and he equates Beelzebub with Satan, Mark 3:23. So he called them to himself and said to them in parables, "How can Satan cast out Satan?" When Jesus hears them talking about Beelzebub, as they call him the ruler of demons, Jesus equates that figure with Satan himself. So based on all this evidence, I would say that Beelzebub or Baal-zebub is one of the titles or names that Satan himself goes by. And Satan, he looks like a bull or an ox. After all, he's a cherub, and the face of a cherub is said to look bovine. So this perfectly jives with New Testament theology on false gods. And it says this in the Old Testament too. In the Old Testament, it was bad to worship idols because it was stupid, because they're hunks of wood or stone. It's dumb. You're worshiping the creations instead of the creator. But in the New Testament, we're also told that idols correspond to actual demons. And you can find this in the Old Testament too, but the New Testament makes this really explicitly clear. Like in 1 Corinthians 10, starting at verse 18, Paul says, "Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? What am I saying then? That an idol is anything? Or what is offered to idols is anything? Rather, that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons." And that's why I didn't take the idol of the little trinkets that you'd find in Hawaii that are for sale at the gift shops. I didn't want to take one of those idols because I don't want to have fellowship with demons. There's a connection between idolatry and demonic figures. And so whenever someone feels an inclination to create an idol of or some kind of image of a false god to worship, they aren't drawing on their own imagination. Evil spirits are putting those visuals into their heads, and they're leading them to create idols that depict just whatever the spirits want. And that's why across hundreds of years and in all kinds of places in the Old Testament, people are constantly being drawn to worship cows or this bovine creature of Baal. It's all planted by Satan. It's all rooted in a desire for Satan to get exactly what he was kicked out of heaven for desiring, to be worshipped as God. Isaiah 14, it tells us that this is what got Satan kicked out of heaven. This was God speaking to Satan. "You have said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High." The worship that Satan was denied in heaven, it's the worship that he desires from people still. And this is what he wanted from Israel, and it's also what he wants from you and me. We'll close down in a few minutes with a quick recap and some personal application of this chapter. And if you have a question, just leave a comment or shoot us an email, crossreferencespodcast@gmail.com. And I'd be happy to take questions or recommendations on subjects that you think I should tackle in the future. So the next time on this podcast, I think we'll discuss an issue that I brought up a few episodes back of what is Abraham's bosom. Now, I don't remember what episode we raised that question, but I've honestly been meaning to address it again. And so we'll do an episode on that, I think, the next time around. So today, just to recap, the main points that we covered, they are as follows. Ezekiel confirmed that a cherub's face is basically the face of an ox or a bovine creature. We talked about how Satan himself was also a cherub. Therefore, Satan has a cow-like face. Baal was an Old Testament deity with a cow-like face, and Baal was also known as Beelzebub, a deity that Jesus referred to as the prince of demons. Or the Pharisees did, but Jesus agreed with them. And also the worship of Baal, or bovine animals. That my big therefore here, that I think it's therefore actually a form of worshiping Satan directly. And so therefore Satan, as we've said several times, what does Satan look like? I guess he looks like a cow. I might have mentioned this before, I might not have, but I grew up on a farm. Now, nobody ever believes me whenever I say that, but I honestly did. A 500-acre farm. Now, I don't live on a farm anymore, but I did for 20 years. And we had dozens, maybe more than 100 cows on the farm. And I know we teach kids that cows say moo. The sounds that cows make, to me, I've never thought they sounded like a moo. Especially when I was a kid. Like, I remember reading about Baal in the Old Testament, and I would think, Baal, that sounds like the sound that cows make. Like, if you ever hear cows, they're going, Baal. So, I don't know, maybe I just always had it in my head, even when I was a kid, that Baal was a cow-like being. I don't know. But as an adult, when I studied this a few years ago, I can't say I was surprised to find out that it was literally true. Other than that, I have no idea why so many people in the Bible really wanted to worship cows. The Israelites, they literally got excited about the golden calves. And they said, these are the gods who brought us out of Egypt. It's so stupid, I just can't even wrap my head around it most times. If it were turtles, maybe it'd make a little more sense to me. But cows? They're not even, one of the brightest animals out there, okay? Believe me, I've spent a lot of time around cows. Have you ever looked into the eyes of a cow? There's not much going on in there. But I guess that makes it a bit fair that Satan looks like them. The New Testament says that Satan goes about as a roaring lion. Now notice it doesn't say he is a roaring lion, just that he goes about as one. His real face is not the face of a lion, it's a cow. And whenever you think of it that way, maybe his face is a little more fitting. Satan goes about as a lion, but there's only one real lion. That's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. That's who we worship, and Satan gets none of it. And neither do turtles. Thanks for listening to the Cross References podcast. This has been Luke Taylor, reminding you that I really did grow up on a farm.